The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Welcome to unit number 5, and I'm looking forward to working with you in the next hour. So we're going to talk about conflict today. We're talking about negotiation skills, and I guess if you think about it, negotiation is just another form of conflict. In other words, when you're negotiating, it's because there's two different viewpoints. And when there are two different viewpoints, of course, that is arguably the definition of conflict. So negotiation and conflict are pretty much the same thing as far as I'm concerned. So we'll have a look at those as we go through. Okay, so let's take a look at where we've come from so far in our approach and what we've been looking at in relation to the areas that we've covered. So we've looked at influence at the executive level. We've looked at strategic management performance. We've looked at creating. We've looked at creative thinking. We've looked at options for organisational restructuring. Today, of course, we're going to be looking at negotiation and conflict management. And next time we meet, we're going to look at driving positive cultural change. All right, so conflict is where we start today. So let's have a look at what we had to do last time. You might recall that last time we did look at the notion of spending some time, for you at least, making some changes to your structure of your team, or at least thinking about how you might do that. And so I hope you've had a chance to do that, because really how you structure your team is pretty critical to how performance is managed. And so, and of course, the other thing about this is that there's no right answer. There's no one way. And of course, it's not always that simple to do. So there's lots of different ways that we can deal with that. So we're going to look at a couple of things today which are important. We're going to look at the concept of political awareness, and a lot of people say to me, and you can imagine, and you may well be one of those people that might say this to me, is that I'm not really interested in organisational politics. I come to work, I do my job, and I go home, and I don't want to get involved in all of that other stuff. Trouble is, of course, is that political awareness is part and parcel of life, and we just need to be savvy and good at it because it is part of the deal. We'll look at the model, and that's the conflict model, and basically what I'm drawing upon there is Thomas Kilmann model, which has been around for a little while, but it's probably the most reputable model around dealing with conflict. And what the model shows you is 5 different ways of dealing with conflict. And the argument is not that one of those 5 ways is better than another. The argument is that each of them have their place depending on what it is that we're actually trying to do. And then what we'll do is we'll then look at when you could use those different styles and give you some clues on that. And then what I want to finish up with is give you a couple of case studies and ask you to consider which of those approaches you might use, considering the 5 different approaches that I'm sharing with you. And then I guess the whole purpose of today is for you to walk out and say, okay, if plan A doesn't work, I need to try plan B or even plan C or D. And in other words, being flexible about how you deal with conflict. So I hope you had a chance to complete your conflict diagnostic, so that you're coming to this session prepared to be able to look at your own particular style of conflict. All right, so as I said earlier, let's look at political skills, and I'm going to call on Baddeley's model here, which I think is a very good model and one that makes a lot of sense. And hopefully I can just dispel some myths around organisational politics by doing this. So we have on the horizontal axis, we have at one end game players. Now, we all know game players. They're people who are always on the make. They're always serving their own interests before the interests of others. And I'm sure you could identify some people in your organisation that are game players, because it's often fairly obvious that they are game players. But at the other end of the continuum, we have people who act with integrity, and I'm sure you could hopefully identify some of those people as well. So you've got game players at one end, people who act with integrity at the other, and then basically most of us will fall in between the two. So that's one sort of continuum, and the other one, the vertical one, is that we have people who are actually very politically savvy. They're politically aware. They're very astute, and they understand the lie of the land politically in their organisation. And we also have, of course, at the other end of the continuum, people who are politically unaware. And these are people who really either don't have an interest in politics or just are oblivious to its impact on their work and how it fits in. So that's the model. And now what we have is a typical 2x2 matrix. So what we have is, let's start over in the top left-hand corner. We have people who are politically aware, who are game players. So they're always trying to, they're always on the take. We might call them foxes. So the trouble with foxes, of course, is that everybody knows that they're foxes. And because everybody knows they're foxes, they have to be even more politically, they have to be even more cunning to get their own way. So they have to try doubly hard to get what they want in the organisational context, because everyone is on guard and aware of them and what they're trying to do. Then we have people who are still game players, but they're very poor at it. In other words, they're politically unaware. So these people are still trying to get what they want, but they're not very good at it because they're not very good at reading people or situations, and we would call them donkeys. And we all know people who really are very poor at playing the political game, but they're always on the trying to play it anyway, and they don't do it very well. Now, you don't want to be either of those two. I mean, that's the point. It's not actually helpful to be a fox or a donkey. So if we go to the other end of the continuum, which is the acting with integrity, we've got people who are politically unaware who act with integrity. And people who are politically unaware who act with integrity, in other words, they basically say, they rationalise and say, I'm just here to do my job. I'm not actually interested in getting involved in organisational politics. We could call them lambs to the slaughter, perhaps. In other words, they often do get taken advantage of because they really don't believe that politics is a critically important part or element of organisational life. And then, of course, where you need to be as a leader is up in the top right-hand quadrant, and that is wise. You need to be politically aware, but nevertheless acting with integrity. So in other words, why Baddeley's model is so powerful is it says that you can be politically aware and still act with integrity. And so people who do this are what we might refer to as owls. So they still act with integrity, so there's no lying or backbiting or underhandedness, but they're also very astute about political awareness. Now, let me define political awareness for a moment, because I think sometimes people get the wrong idea. All political awareness is an empathy with the actions that I am proposing to make. So before I send an email, or before I address a meeting, or before I even speak up at a meeting, I just momentarily think of the implications of that and how that might be perceived and the impact that that will have on other groups and people. And once I've thought that through, I can then make a judgment call about whether it might be a wise thing to send the email or to say what I need to say. So political awareness is just having an empathy about how your actions impact on the actions of other people, and to consider whether that impact is going to be positive or negative, and of course to mitigate the negative impact and to maximise the positive. So you can still act with integrity and be politically aware. Mind you, the higher you go up in an organisation, the more difficult it is to do, I might say. Okay, so that's political awareness, and I just wanted to put it out there because I think, it's a very important concept that I think sometimes leaders lose sight of because they believe that they don't want to be associated with politics because in some way they perceive it to be game playing, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be, and I guess that's my main point. So here's the model, the conflict and the negotiation model that Thomas Kilmann had put together. Thomas Kilmann had designed this model where you can see that on the left-hand side there is assertiveness. So at the bottom there you've got low assertion, and then at the top you've got high assertion. So in conflict, a high assertion would mean pretty much sticking to your view and not budging, and whereas a low assertion would be perhaps to let the other person win the battle or perhaps not engage. And then across the bottom there in the horizontal bar, you've got cooperativeness. So on the left-hand side, you've got low cooperativeness, and on the right-hand side, you've got high cooperativeness. So on the left-hand side, this would be where you didn't want to cooperate with someone. And then on the right-hand side, this is where you'd go out of your way to cooperate with others. So what the argument is that any conflict, any situation where there's disagreement will basically be determined by both a level of assertion by the two key players and the degree to which they might want to cooperate. So that's how that works. So what you have there is and I'll just run through them briefly because I'll go through them in more detail in a moment, but you can check your diagnostic and just see where you fit too, because a relatively high score is a 10, 11 and 12, and a low score is a 0, 1 or a 2. But what you're also looking for is the relative score to the other scores. So if there's one that's clearly higher than the other 4, or likewise clearly lower than the other 4, then it's probably an area that you probably need to consider. So for example, if it's a relatively high score, it's probably likely that you're using it too often. And if it's a relatively low score, it's probably likely that you don't feel comfortable using it and probably don't as a result of that. So that's where the diagnostic is very valuable. So if you start with the competing, this is where competing is a win-lose strategy. That's where you win and the person that you're having the conflict with loses, or at least that's your intention. So obviously it's high on assertion because you've got to stick to your guns, but it's low on cooperativeness because you're just trying to beat the other person. And there's a time and a place to be competitive. Not everything, of course, but there is a certain time and a place, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But if you've got a relatively low score there, it probably suggests that you need to be sometimes a little bit more assertive in conflict situations. And if you've got a relatively high score, it probably means that you're getting a little bit you're too interested in winning, and sometimes it might be a good idea to back off. So if we go to the opposite end, you've got accommodating. Accommodating is where it's actually a lose-win. So this is where you lose and the other person wins. And you might think, well, how does that work? Well, it's the old adage of you let them win the battle so you can win the war. So there might be that you make concessions to the other person so that you can then, gain some sort of credibility, then later on cash in on those concessions. Or it might be that the other person's issue is more important to them than it is to you, and the relationship fundamentally is important, working relationship. So you decide that you might let them have it their way because it's less important to you than it is to them. Now, if we go to avoiding, it's low on cooperation and low on cooperativeness and low on assertion. In other words, if I avoid something, I'm not going to deal with it. And I suppose on face value, that might seem like a strange and non-productive thing to do in terms of dealing with conflict, but there are many opportunities where we should avoid. So, for example, if we need more information before we actually engage, then we might buy ourselves time and space by asking for the other person if I can check out my facts and I'll come back to them. Not as an excuse to fob them off, but an excuse to actually create the time to actually get the information that you need to discuss it with the person. So if you had a relatively high score in avoiding, it probably suggests that you are avoiding things that you really probably should deal with. But then again, if you had a relatively low score in avoiding, it probably suggests that you are probably getting involved in too many things around the place, too many arguments, and you really probably should just let a few of them go because, frankly, they're not necessarily helpful for you. You can't be involved in everything around the place, not involved in every bun fight. That's just not possible, and nor is it productive to be in that way. So we have here compromising, and you'll notice it's halfway between assertiveness and halfway between cooperativeness. Because when you compromise, what happens is you make concessions. So I make a concession, I say to someone, I'm willing to concede this, and in return, they're willing to concede something else. So we're halfway up the ladder, if you like, of assertion, and we're halfway up the ladder of cooperativeness. So purchasing a house is often a case of being compromising, that the seller has a price in mind, and the buyer usually ask for something less, and assuming that the seller is happy, then they will compromise on a deal and then the sale is done. So that's probably, in our society at least, the most common form of dealing with conflict. However, if you look at your own scores, if you had a relatively high score on compromising compared with the other scores, it's likely perhaps that you are going to have problems dealing with people who don't want to compromise with you. In fact, it's going to be very frustrating, and there are plenty of those out there. So compromising is only good when the other person's willing to compromise, and if they're not, then it's going to not work, and you're going to have to move to another one of these conflict strategies. Now, collaboration looks like it's the ultimate, doesn't it? It's high on cooperativeness and high on assertion. And so when you collaborate with someone, and people often get collaboration and compromising mixed up, but when you collaborate with someone, what you're actually doing is you're trying to determine a new way forward, something that you both can decide where you get all your needs met, but it might require a lot of discussion. So the big weakness of collaboration is that you will require time to talk things through. And so if you had a very high score in collaboration, that's fine, but just understand that not everything is open to that, because you don't have the luxury of time, because you have to talk things through to the other party in order to get that. And of course, the other thing is the other party doesn't always want to collaborate with you. Now, what's interesting there is if you look at your compromising score and your collaboration score, you'll notice, just see if there's any great difference between the two. And my suggestion is if you've got a high score in compromising relative to collaboration, then what you should do is if compromising doesn't work, then you should ask the other person if they're willing to work with you to see if you can come up with some new way of dealing with this. That's a good thing, because then you move yourself from compromising to collaboration. And of course, if the other person's not interested, then clearly you need to move into another one of those boxes. So that's the model. It's a great model, very practical, and what it means is that if one doesn't work, you try another one, and so forth. Let me give you let me give an example. Let's say that two of your team members are having a conflict. For whatever reason, they're just having an altercation, and you decide that, they're grown people, they should be able to sort out their own problem, I won't get involved. So you decide to avoid. Obviously, you don't do anything about it, you think they can sort it out and it's not worth you getting involved. However, as time goes on, the volume gets higher, people are actually quite heated, it's starting to get quite serious, and you decide that you can't avoid it anymore, and you pull both people aside and you go into your office and you ask one person what they think and the other person. You try to compromise. You try to be the peacemaker and compromise, and you find that both parties aren't interested. Well, that's not going to work. So you actually say to both of them, well, look, if you aren't willing to compromise, are you willing to work with me to come up with a new way of solving this so that you're both happy? And it doesn't seem like you're getting very far as a result of that. So you then decide to pull rank as the supervisor or the leader or the team leader and just say, right, well, this is what's happening. You're going to do this and you're going to do that. You've now actually gone through 1, 2, 3, 4 different approaches. Now, there's no guarantee it's going to resolve the conflict, but the point is by engaging 4 different strategies, you may well get a result. So that's the whole point of the exercise. So you might want to consider it that way. Now, what I want to do now is go through each in a little bit more detail and talk a little bit around when you should use each approach. And then once I've done that, what I'd like to do is to share, as I said at the outset, some case studies and ask you to consider which of those you would use for each. All right, so let's have a look at competing. So competing is pretty important when we have to make quick decisions. In other words, we don't have a lot of time to negotiate or talk to the other person. And frankly, a decision just has to be made because we've got a deadline to meet. So it might be a customer-focused situation or might be even a crisis. We just have to get on and make the decision. And in that approach, it would be perfectly valid. Another case is where someone might be taking advantage of your goodwill, and you've decided to dig your heels in and say enough is enough, and I'm not budging. And that would be perfectly appropriate in certain circumstances where people are actually trying to take advantage of your goodwill. Another circumstance is where you have to make an unpopular decision with your team, and you decide to make that unpopular decision and let people know what that decision is and preface it by letting them know that it's unpopular but it had to be made. You're better off doing that than trying to sugarcoat it and using one of the other approaches when in actual fact everyone knows that it's an unpopular decision, because you can't hide the fact that it is. And, you know, all of us as team leaders have to make unpopular decisions. So sometimes it's better just to make it and get on with it. So you can see that competing is appropriate in certain circumstances, but again, you wouldn't want to be using it all the time. And the reason for that is that if you use it all the time, you're typecast as somebody who likes to compete. And so you're going to precipitate 2 responses from people that know you. One response is that they're going to try doubly hard to compete with you, and so they're going to seem overly aggressive in the smallest of situations because they think that you want to win everything. And then on the other hand, they might come at it from the point of view of letting you, not approaching you, they might avoid you because they think there's no point in getting involved in the conflict with you because it's all about win-lose as far as you're concerned. So both of those things aren't necessarily useful for you. Now, when would you accommodate? Well, let's have a look. Now, you would accommodate when the relationship's more important than the issue. So where you would accommodate is that, look, any of us that are in long-term personal relationships would completely understand that you need to accommodate. In other words, there are things that you need to give into because for the sake of the relationship, and that's just that's just the way it is in terms of personal relationships. But also in the workplace, of course, if you've got a colleague and you're likely to get them offside by trying to compete, and quite frankly, their situation is more important to them than yours, it might well be a case where you let them win rather than you try to win. So the other reason that you might want to accommodate is that there is absolutely no chance of you getting your needs met, so you just let the other person win because it's just not going to work any other way. And of course, when it is not very important to you, that's where you might use accommodation as well. So in other words, if it's not that important, why would you bother even trying to expend energy in that conflict situation. Now, where you would avoid, now again, as I said earlier, the word avoid sounds terrible. I mean, why would you be wanting to avoid conflict? Well, there's lots of reasons. Diplomacy would be one of those. So in other words, if you're, for example, talking to someone and they say something that's inaccurate, but the comment that they make is not really going to impact at all on the discussion that you're having at the time, and by correcting them, you may well get them very defensive and they might lose track and focus and all the rest of it. It might well be worth your while not to bother even correcting them. So you avoid what they've said. You just don't mention it. Now, obviously, if it's got an impact on the decision, and clearly they're working from a false scenario, then of course you wouldn't avoid. You can't avoid. Sometimes if two people are in some sort of a heated conversation, both of them are hot under the collar, both of them are upset, it's probably time out would be the best way to approach that. So in other words, taking time out to allow an opportunity to start thinking. I know we've all had this case where we've typed out an email which is really scathing, and we've thought, well, I won't send it. I'll just leave it in my draft box overnight, and then I'll send it tomorrow. And then you look at it in a horrified way the next morning and think, my goodness, what was I thinking last night? If I send that off, it'll cause World War III. All right? Right, so avoiding sometimes gives you that space to make the correct decision. And of course, if the relationship isn't important or the issue, then why in heaven's name would you bother even engaging? So there is a particular reason for avoiding, and it's quite valid in certain circumstances. And as I said earlier, sometimes you want to find out more before you engage. So you might say to a customer, for example, let me do some investigation. What I'll do is I'll come back to you at the end of business this afternoon, but I just need to talk to a few people to find out what's happened at this end, and I'll come back to you. And that means that when you get back to them, you're obviously abreast of what's happened, and you're in a better position to be able to deal with a problem that's occurred. So collaboration, as I said, is the big problem with it, of course, is that you have to have the time to engage in the detailed conversation that's needed to come up with that revolutionary way of solving something. So when would you use it? Well, if the situation, if the issue is important and the relationship, really it's probably a good idea, if you've got the luxury of time, to sit down and try and work through it with the other person. Where an outcome that satisfies both parties sought. So if both parties are very motivated to resolving the issue, then of course you're in a position where you can collaborate. So there's a vested interest in both parties to resolve it, then obviously you're in a position to collaborate. Where all parties need to be committed to a solution, as I mentioned, it's very important that we can probably go there. And sometimes if you do collaborate, you'll actually come up with a better result than you would have had you used the other four, because you have to consider out-of-the-box type solutions and different ways of dealing with things. So it can be quite effective if, of course, you have the time, as I mentioned, to collaborate. Now, compromising, remember, is where you give a bit, the other party gives a bit, so it's different to collaboration. But of course it still requires discussion and negotiation. So if time's running out and a decision needs to be made, so for example, if you are collaborating and you decide that, well, we're getting not as far as we would like, you may have to make the decision to compromise on the basis of that. Sometimes it can be used when collaboration or competing have failed. All right, so you decide to use it as a result. And it can be temporary, so short-term solutions can be applied because you have to get a decision made reasonably quickly. It is a reasonable way of doing things, and sometimes, as I said, culturally, it might be the only way that we deal with another culture, or this is the way we do things around here. So it certainly is probably in most cultures an acceptable way of doing business and dealing with conflict. All right, so what you're seeing in front of you right now is you can see that there are advantages. I won't go through all this with you, but you can see there are advantages and disadvantages of each of the different strategies. And so what that implies, of course, is that different situations will require different responses. And even in the one conflict, you could probably use several different approaches. And so a person who's very adept at dealing with negotiation and conflict is likely to use a variety of strategies when they're in discussion with the other person. So in other words, there'll be certain things they won't budge on. There'll be other things they'll make concessions on. There'll be some things that they won't contest. There'll be other things that they'll compromise on, and other things they'll want to collaborate. All of those things have some validity depending on, one, the situation, and two, the other person or persons that you're dealing with at the time. So it's a judgment call about if plan A doesn't work, we try plan B, we try plan C, we try plan D. And as a team leader, of course, you come across conflict all the time, and you are required, of course, to resolve that. And that's why we're doing this today. Right, so what I want to do now is share some scenarios with you and give you a chance to think about which of these things which of these five you might use. Okay, so which of these do you think would be the most appropriate way of dealing with each situation? So let's take the first one. There's only limited information, but there's enough for us to make some judgment calls. So let's say, for example, that a customer calls and they want you to handle an order for them, but you no longer work in that department. So, you know, you've moved, they don't know you've moved, but they've got some sort of a relationship with you, and it's convenient for them to ring you because they know you. We've all done this, of course. But you also know that if you do take this order, it's going to create a major problem internally for you. In other words, some people are going to get their nose out of joint inside the organisation because you've decided to take the order. So what do you do? So let's have a look at the model, and the model's there on the left-hand side. Well, let's look at what you wouldn't do. This is the best way to deal with this and go through it by process of elimination. Well, you can't avoid it, can you? Because the fact is, you know, they've called you and they're on the phone and you can't really avoid it, so you've just got to deal with it. So that's not going to work. If you compete, in other words, you say, no, you must call Fred in such and such a department, it's probably not entirely appropriate because, you know, they're a customer and they've ordered a reasonable amount of product. Probably not good just to fob them off to someone else. So I'm not sure competing is necessarily the right way. Some people would argue you should accommodate, but I don't think that's a good idea either, because if you accommodate, what are you doing? Well, you're pleasing them, of course, in the short term, but you're going to have a price to pay, aren't you, internally? Plus the fact that what you're also doing is you're encouraging them to come to you the next time, and it's going to be even harder for you to suggest that you go and talk to Fred in the other department. So I'm not sure that accommodation is actually your correct strategy. So you're really left with two, to compromise or collaborate. Now, I suspect probably the right thing to do would be to suggest that you would introduce or make an introduction to Fred in the other department, and so that next time that you have an order, you can talk to Fred because he will be in the best position to deal with it. So that would be collaboration. And internally people are happy. The customer obviously ultimately will be happy, and you'll be happy. So that's why it's a collaboration. So I think that's probably the way to go there. All right. So situation two. Now, situation two is a personal one, so it becomes a little bit more interesting. Okay. So you put your car in for repair. Okay. And so this is a typical scenario. We've all been there, and your car's in for repair, and although they claim that it's fixed, you've got exactly the same problem. So it might be a noise under the bonnet or something. You're not necessarily a mechanic, but it's very obvious that there's a problem. It's not a regular fault, and it is obvious. As I mentioned, you've paid your bill, so you've done that, and you've collected your car, so you've done all that, and you're not prepared to pay any more, which is fair enough. And they are the only dealer that is all at all convenient to you. So you want your car fixed properly now, of course. So what do? Well, let's have a look. Now, you can't avoid it, can you? Because the car's obviously not fixed. You paid your bill, so you can't avoid it. That's not going to work. You can go and you can just rationalise and accommodate and say, oh, well, maybe they were just busy and maybe I can deal with it and it'll be okay. So I don't think accommodation is the right way to go, because clearly you have paid for something that hasn't been fixed. It's hard to say how you could compromise, really, and collaboration may be last resort, but I think in this case the appropriate way of dealing with this conflict would be to compete. You don't have to be going in all guns blazing, shouting and screaming, but you might suggest to them that there is the fault, it still needs to be fixed, and you'd like it fixed, and when would you be able to fix it at your earliest convenience? And hopefully reason will prevail and sanity will prevail, and you will get your car fixed on time. Situation 3. Okay, you're a manager you're a manager of a team that currently has a manual recording system, and your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. So that's your analysis. But Susan Jones runs a similar kind of operation in another team. She's disagreed with your proposition and cites customer concerns and employee resistance plus technical problems with the system you're proposing. So you're at loggerheads with someone on equal footing with you in the workplace. However, your manager, that's the manager that you and Susan report to, has told you both that you've got to resolve the situation and you must both run the same way, but he or she doesn't mind which way that is as long as it's the one way. So how do you fix that? You can't avoid it. You've got to deal with it, so that's not going to work. I don't think it's appropriate to accommodate, because the fact is your approach may actually be better than Susan's, and in the interests of the team, it may well be worthwhile considering. So that's not going to be good. And besides, you feel quite strongly about your approach. It's a bit hard to compromise, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it's either got to be automated or not. So it's a bit hard to have half a system that's automated and half not. It's not really possible to compete because Susan is on equal footing with you, and it's her word and your word, so that's probably not going to work very well. But I think probably what would work well is a collaboration. So you might say to Susan, look, let's try it my way for the first week, and let's try it your way for the following week, assuming this is possible. And let's then compare notes and bring our teams together and work out which is the better way on the basis of a trial. Now, if she's very confident about her approach, you could probably only say yes to that, and you're confident about your approach, and let's just see where the cards fall. That would be a way of resolving that. Situation 4 is a personal one, and it's an interesting one. Your boss has a personal dislike to one of your team, okay, and is insisting on you firing that person. Now, while you recognise some occasional problems with that person, you can manage that quite easily, and in fact, that person is important to the team output. So what do you do? Okay, what do you do in that situation? Well, it's probably not a good idea to it's probably not a good idea to accommodate. In other words, you go off and sack them, because everyone else in the team is going to think, well, if that's how you treat everybody in your team, then why wouldn't you do the same thing to me? So you're going to have a little bit of a mutiny on your hands there. So if you decide to, compromising is difficult. You could perhaps, explain to your person that they need to pull their head in, but at the same time you could go into bat for them with your boss. You could certainly respectfully compete and point out that they are in fact quite useful, although occasionally they are a pain in the neck. But at the end of the day, they still get their work done, and you've got a personal dislike, not anything to do with the work that they do. You might collaborate, put them on another shift or whatever, but I think at the end of the day, you could also avoid. In other words, just test the water. If they come back to you again and say, have you got rid of so-and-so, of course, they're serious, and you can try a plan B, but you just might rationalise that they're having a bad day, and because they're having a bad day, you may not go there. So that could work well for you. Okay, that's 4. Last one, situation 5. As a manager, you want to design a new system in a way that suits you. That's your approach. Your approach at the managers' meeting is to raise it with all the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. One of the other managers says it's too costly that way and that each manager should simply offer their approach to the general manager to make a decision. So what they're doing effectively is avoiding it. They're wanting to pass the buck up the line. But you have got a very strong view that you want to design a way that suits you. So what this is about is how you might respond to that interaction. So what would you do? Well, you can't avoid it because they've said what they've said, so that's not going to work. You could sort of gently contest it and compete and say, look, why don't we work out what we're doing, and say to them then, and if after half an hour of discussion we can't come to some sort of a resolution, then I'll take your suggestion on board and we'll go and let the general manager make the decision. So that way you're collaborating, but you're also suggesting that you're willing to compromise. In other words, I'm willing to let you win if we don't get our way. So that would probably be the way to deal with it. So really, in the sense, you're using all of those things in a way except avoiding. In that case, you're gently pushing back on the person to say that I think we should make the decision. You are accommodating their interests by saying, well, let's collaborate first, and if that fails, we'll go with your suggestion. So it's kind of like you're using a lot of those approaches. Okay, so what's the key message out of all of this for you? Now, the key message is pretty straightforward, but not easy to do, and that is to be flexible. Don't overuse your preferred style. Don't overuse it. And if plan A doesn't work, then it's not the end of the earth. You've got a plan B or a C or a D or whatever you might have. So in other words, you've got a whole lot of other options that are open to you that you can use, and you should be prepared to use those if and when you need them. So the whole point is that next time you're in conflict, don't keep pushing with your approach. Mentally step back for a little bit and think, is there another way that I can deal with this that may get the result that I need or may get the result that we all need? And you step back. And of course, another couple of questions you can ask yourself is simply, is this relationship more important than the issue, or is the issue more important than the relationship? And if you can work out that, then it sort of pushes you into a couple of options. So, for example, if the relationship is more important than the issue, then it's likely that you can then consider collaboration and accommodation. However, if the issue is paramount to the business, then you would really be able to deal with it in terms of competing because, frankly, it has to happen for whatever reason. Not that I think it should, it has to happen. So that's the sort of message that we want out of it. So guess what homework is? I want you to actually go out. I want you to try and use all 5. I want you to experiment with this. I want you to try things. I want you to actually try plan A, try plan B, just really start to look. And, the good news is 2 people on a desert island and there's conflict. So you won't have any shortage of opportunities to practice this. And so next time you're in conflict, I want you to try and use a more flexible approach in dealing with it and just see what happens. And that's the key thing. So, folks, that's it for me, and I'm done. So I will make sure, of course, that I'll be sending out the slides for you, and also, of course, the video. And so I just wanted to say thank you, and just say that I've enjoyed working with you today, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time. And thank you, and I wish you a very enjoyable weekend. Thanks, guys, and all the best. Thank you, and goodbye.